Hey, I'm Nate Fosaaen. I'm a professional archaeologist currently excavating in North Texas, and I specialize in the archaeology of the indigenous peoples of North America prior to the colonization by Europeans, especially in the region that we call the Eastern Woodlands. I've been working in this area for more than 10 years at this point, so I've got a fair amount of experience to draw on when I'm making these videos. Today I want to talk about one of the newer ideas that's been floating around in the archaeology of the Eastern Woodlands, and that's the possibility that large areas in the southeast were periodically abandoned during the end of the early Archaic period and then repopulated by a brand new group of people in the middle Archaic period. I'll post a link to my video explaining time periods in North American archaeology because I'm aware most people aren't very familiar with how we break up time. So this is a bit of a complicated concept, but I'll try to boil it down to as simple terms as I can. So basically, up until about 10 years ago, there was this tacit assumption that everyone here in the Eastern Woodlands, all of those cultures, were the descendants of whatever local Clovis populations there were in the middle of the Paleo-Indian period. And that one lineage fractured and split and diversified until we got all of the different archaeological cultures that we see prehistorically, and then eventually down to modern day indigenous populations. So under that model, all of that cultural diversity was descended from one founding population into a single family tree, basically. Then an archaeologist named Ken Sassaman published this book, The Eastern Archaic Historicized, and that book he used to connect some dots, and he came up with what's called a two ancestry model, which goes something like this. So the Clovis people and their descendants lived all over what is now the Eastern Woodlands. They had a very particular relationship with their dead, and in that they tended to bury or cremate them outside of living spaces. So you have the areas that you spend your time in your life and you eat and live and sleep and all that, and then you have these consecrated areas where human remains are deposited and interred, specific designated mortuary locations. And as time went on and the climates became warmer and the megafauna died out, this lineage began using more notched spear types, such as Kirks, and moved north and into the mountains to follow the cold weather game that they were accustomed to living on. That was the backbone of their economy, was these cold weather game species. So Sassaman says, quote, that resident populations would have welcomed ameliorating climate and flocked to the south to enjoy its benefits is the bias of Western thinking. In fact, the opposite is more consistent with the empirical record. That some populations who experienced the warming decades of the Pleistocene in the southern latitudes followed clines of changing climate and associated flora and fauna northward and into the Appalachians. This left large portions of the southeast uninhabited. Another archaeologist named Andy White has done some preliminary work compiling radiocarbon dates, and there's a conspicuous absence of dates in the deep south from this time period. I also kind of noticed from my own time working the Tennessee River Valley, we had lots of late Archaic sites and several very early Archaic sites, but there did seem to be sort of a gap in the middle Archaic in between. Now, when these areas in the lowlands and the southeast are reoccupied, there's a fairly abrupt discontinuity in culture. Suddenly, the Morrow Mountain culture shows up, where their early Archaic predecessors made spears and knives out of very high-grade stone and used notched types. This new Morrow Mountain people would habitually make contracting stem points out of very low-grade cherts and even worse, quartz. And I flint knap. I make stone tools out of chipping stone the same way that prehistoric cultures did, and quartz is the worst material ever to work with. It doesn't fracture predictably. It tends to have these flaws and micro breaks in it, and if you hit it the wrong way and the flakes don't come off, what happens is it's bruising, so it creates these early fractures, and if you come at it from another angle, it's going to just shatter on you. So trying to work with quartz is the end result is never very good, and it requires a much higher level of skill to do anything with it. But Morrow Mountain cultures seem to be targeting it to a certain degree.
So just to illustrate this point, this is one that I made out of a white Burlington tree that's been heat treated, and you can see that it's fairly thin. It's got a decent expanding stemmed base on it, good barbs. Pretty easy to work with. This is a contracting stemmed, something similar to a Morrow Mountain quartz point. It's fat. I can't really get a whole lot of good shape out of it. It's not particularly sharp. It's fairly heavy. And this is the stuff that these newcomers were seemingly targeting as one of their main sources of material for making stone tools.
So Morrow Mountain peoples would also bury their dead within living spaces. That's in very stark contrast to the way that earlier Archaic peoples were burying their dead in designated, consecrated burial mortuary spaces. So the shell mounds that I've mentioned before in sort of the Tennessee, Kentucky area, these mounds are built from the refuse from freshwater mussel feasts, which earlier Archaic peoples didn't really seem to emphasize quite so much. But they're also monuments that contain burials that include elaborate grave goods and dog burials, so they're not just trash piles. They're places where living people held celebrations in the presence of the dead. And the shell mound builders who belonged to this, Morrow Mountain culture, saw fit to bury their dead with high status items in the shells produced by their feasting. So there's clearly some kind of religious belief surrounding shellfish like mussels. At the site Black Cat Cave that I've talked about in previous videos, the human burials there are buried in shell. They've got shell piled up around them. And that cave is not close to a water source that has shellfish. So they're having to truck in shell, probably by basket, and deposit them deliberately in this mortuary context. That means that it's not expedient, it's out of the way. There's a very clear connection between the symbolism of death and the symbolism of the shell. So this is some kind of religious symbolism going on here. So Sassaman's idea is that these newcomers came into the Southeast from the Pacific Northwest following the Missouri River until they hit the Mississippi River. And once you hit the Mississippi, you have access to the Tennessee and the Ohio River, and that can get you all into Appalachia and the Southeast very, very quickly. Into these regions that had been previously abandoned by earlier Archaic peoples, as I mentioned, moving up north and up into the mountains. During the early Archaic, there are groups up there around up around Idaho that use very similar leaf-shaped projectile points, similar to Morrow Mountain points, and they also intensively use riverine resources. So they've got a method to get into the region, and there's enough cultural similarity to think that they might be the group that is producing this second ancestry that came into the Southeast during the Middle Archaic. This sudden influx of an entirely new ethnic group that had very different beliefs about the treatment of the dead, as well as very different lifestyles and subsistence strategies, may in some way be related to why we see the first monuments being built here in the Southeast during the Middle Archaic. Being very suddenly confronted with a brand new ethnic group that you've never seen before, that doesn't look like you, doesn't behave like you at all, has a very different language than you. Having this confrontation of an other group of people may have created a new emphasis on the importance of ancestry and ethno-linguistic identity in the Southeast that didn't really exist before. And group solidarity can be generated and reinforced by celebrating religious festivals at designated monumental structures that communities built together among people claiming the same ancestry. Because it's not really about whether or not you actually have the same ancestry, it's about the ancestry that you claim and that you can support by the way you live and the rituals that you and your family are involved in. So again, this is a really new idea in the archaeology of the southeast of North America, and it's going to take some time to hash out what parts of this migration model hold up and work and which get knocked down. But overall, I think Sassaman makes some really compelling arguments, and I haven't presented all of his lines of evidence here. I've just kind of hit on the ones that I think are easiest to explain in video format, and some of the stronger ones that I think are most well supported. But it's going to be interesting to see in the next decade or two how all of this shakes out. As always, if you have any questions about this or anything else related to the archaeology of North America, please leave those down in the comments. I hope you found this interesting, and thank you for watching.